Good afternoon. My name is Hugh Forrest, and I am the Chief Programming Officer at South by Southwest. Welcome to the final session for Sunday, March 13th. A few items of housekeeping before we get into today's fascinating discussion. Today was the first day of the trade show, otherwise known as the Creative Industries Expo. It closes at 5 p.m., but it will be open again Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Please check that out. Today is the second and final day of South by Southwest Pitch, which showcases some of the world's best startups. That ends, I believe, at 6, but the award show for Pitch starts at 6:30. So if you want to check out some cool startups, check that out, please. Had a great keynote today with Lizzo. Tomorrow's keynote is VR pioneer Celine Tricart. That is at 1 p.m., Ballroom D. I want to also mention, and particularly in the context of this discussion we have coming up, we have a special keynote on Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. That is Maria Ressa, the Filipino journalist who is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. She will be in conversation with Nadia of Pussy Riot. They will be talking about how to stand up to a dictator. So check that out. Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock. There'll be another keynote Tuesday at 1 p.m. also. So Tuesday, we actually have 2 keynotes. Okay, back to the here and now for this session. Probably like a lot of people in this room, one of my silver linings for the last 24 months of COVID was I got to read a lot more than I usually do. Read a lot of books, which is great. Amidst all the problems of COVID, that was a good thing. One of the 20 or so books that I read over the last 2 years, one of the most memorable ones was titled, "This is How They Tell Me the World Ends," by today's speaker, Nicole Perlroth. This book is a fantastic read and also a terrifying read, particularly in light of current events in Eastern Europe. We are honored to have Nicole here. She's beaming in from San Francisco. Interviewing her on stage will be Jonathan Reiber of AttackIQ. Please give a big welcome to Jonathan and Nicole.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. Hey, everybody. Hi, Nicole. Can you see and hear me?
Hi. Yeah.
That's great. This reminds me of the, raise your hand if you remember the Apple advert from the 80s with the guy who threw the hammer with the big head. Yeah, it's Nicole. You appear as a small here, but yeah. So, we're gathering, Nicole's written this great book, and we're going to get into it, but we're obviously gathering in this moment of crisis where the findings of her book and her experience reporting on cybersecurity and cyberspace operations over the last decade are particularly salient. And so we'll get into that. Here's her book. I also read it when I interviewed her last May. It's a great book, fast read, full of good information. And Nicole recently left the New York Times to pursue an even greater course of action in my mind, which is public service. She's recently become an advisor at CISA, which is the U.S. government's cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency. So she'll talk a little bit about that. By way of introduction, my background, folks in the Pentagon used to call me Cyber Reiber, which is an unfortunate moniker that never goes away. I was a speechwriter and chief strategy officer for cyber policy in the Pentagon, where I served for 7 years in the Obama administration, and now I work for a cybersecurity company. So let's get into it. And we'll talk for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions on Slido. So keep the opportunity in mind to ask questions, although I won't necessarily guarantee we'll answer all of them. Nicole, your book opens in Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit about why that was and where you went from there?
Hi, everyone. It does feel weird to be beaming in virtually, but sorry I can't be there, and someone pour some out for me, please. I'll just start by saying I've never felt so intimately connected to a crisis like this before. I went to Ukraine in 2019, and the reason I went there was because Ukraine really is Russia's petri dish. for its cyber operations. If you want to know what Russia can do in the cyber realm, you need to look at Ukraine. And for years, Russia had basically been testing every cyber capability they had against Ukraine. They had shut down the power twice. They had tried to interfere in their election, which we should have been paying closer attention to. But interestingly, in 2014, they actually hacked the system that reports election results to the Ukrainian media to call the election for a far-right Nazi candidate. And it's not that this candidate was pro-Russia, it's that Russia was trying to basically orchestrate something very similar to what they're doing right now with the pretext for their invasion, where they said, see, Ukraine can't be trusted to elect its own leaders. If left to its own devices, they will elect a Nazi as their president. And unfortunately, they got very far, and we should have been paying closer attention. But fortunately, the Ukrainians picked it up just in time. So if you wanted to know what Russia could do in this realm, I knew I had to go to Ukraine. And so I went to Ukraine, and the most recent attack had been this attack where Russia actually took stolen NSA hacking tools and fired them at Ukraine. And that attack looked like ransomware, a ransomware called Petya, but ultimately it wasn't ransomware. There was no way for victims to pay up. So security researchers called it not Petya. And it wiped Ukraine government agencies' data. It paralyzed banks, paralyzed railway systems. People couldn't get money out of the ATMs. People couldn't pay for gas at gas stations. You couldn't buy a train ticket. The postal service, their data was obliterated. Pension checks that were sent out were never received. And it even hit the radiation systems at the old Chernobyl nuclear site, which is now back in the news. And I'm thinking of all the people I interviewed there who were in charge of monitoring radiation and saw their screens literally go black during this attack. And it didn't just hit Ukraine, it actually bled out, and it hit any business that had even a single employee working remotely from Ukraine. So it had hit Merck, it hit FedEx, it hit Pfizer, it hit the world's biggest shipping conglomerate in Denmark. And all told, it cost $10 billion in damages. I mean, Merck will tell you now that the survival of their company was at stake because of this Russian attack on Ukraine. They couldn't run their vaccine production systems. They had to tap into the CDC's emergency stockpiles of the Gardasil vaccine that year. And I knew that I needed to go to Ukraine to really see what ground zero for that attack looked like, because what it was really a test run, is what the Ukrainians told me. They actually said, we think that we are basically the test kitchen and that ultimately you're the end target. But you better pay attention, because when something like this comes for you directly, when Russia feels like it has the geopolitical impetus to pull the trigger on these capabilities directly against the West, it will be so much worse because you are so much more automated. And so that's really how my book began, which is, this is how the Ukrainians basically tell me the world will end. And now, those words feel more relevant than ever.
Yeah, certainly do. What are some of your thoughts about the current conflict and the cyberspace risks and the cyberspace operations that are occurring within it?
Well, this is really where the most interesting discussions are happening right now. We fully expected that when Russia invaded Ukraine, they would do what they had done before. They would potentially take the power grid out in Ukraine. They would launch a wiping malware campaign like they did in the NotPetya attack. It has been much more muted than we expected. They didn't shut the power down. They did launch wiping attacks, but they were fairly limited, and cybersecurity companies and those on the ground were able to mitigate them quite quickly and really limit the blast radius. So it has not been as substantial as we all expected. But my take on it is, it's pure speculation. You'd have to be a fly on Putin's wall to really understand why he didn't go further. And the theories are either he so grossly underestimated the time it would take to capture Kyiv, for example, that he thought they would need to have the power infrastructure in place because they would get there and capture it in 2 days, as the intelligence suggests. He thought would happen. That's what he thought the timeline would be. The other theory is that he was maybe more weary of triggering a direct cyber escalation with the West. I mean, in the days leading up to Russia's invasion, Biden said, if they launch cyber attacks and it hits us here, we will respond proportionally. And I think the lesson from NotPetya was it's hard to keep these attacks contained. These are not precision tools. Often they leak out and there is a lot of collateral damage. So perhaps he wasn't ready to risk a kind of cyber attack that would trigger a direct conflict with the West. But we really don't know. And frankly, I think we are going to probably start seeing more cyber activity coming out of Russia. I mean, we exchanged articles the other day, which we've seen now Russia, the NSA is investigating whether Russia hacked a Western satellite internet company. We saw them conduct the wiping attacks. I think the more we tighten the screws on the Kremlin with sanctions and now with the ban of Russian imports like oil and now vodka and diamonds, the less they have to lose. And the less they have to lose, the more likely they are to use cyber as a retaliatory tool. And unfortunately, what most Americans don't understand is that that would be a very powerful, potentially successful weapon to use against the United States. One, because we are so vulnerable, and two, because we are so just held hostage by our own politics. And I think in this case, cyber is a powerful psychological tool. I mean, there's a reason why when Russia hit Ukraine's power grid, they hit it for a number of hours, right? It wasn't designed to stay down. The message was, we have the ability to shut down the grid at will. So it would be a powerful psychological tool here, I think. The other thing is, for the most part, Americans are coming together in support of sanctions, and we all have an appetite to sort of sustain these gas hikes, et cetera. But what if Russia launches a colonial pipeline type attack on steroids, where he conducts a coordinated attack on our gas pipelines, potentially just straight from the GRU, which does a lot of these destructive attacks, or through proxies like cyber criminals or ransomware groups? You know, what appetite will we have then to continue tightening the screws when we can't get gas, or when the cost of gas is so astronomical, or we can't get diesel that we require to run our factories? And so I am very worried about what the next few weeks and months hold.
Yeah. You've talked about the idea of mutually assured digital destruction. And as you're talking, you're speaking within an escalation ladder a little bit, like the more screws and pressure get put on him through the various means that are being applied, which is arming the Ukrainians, the sanctions, alliance commitments, that may alter then the mutually assured digital destruction calculus itself, right? So he may have a series of choices to make within it. Within our country, the work that he's done over the last, he and his security agencies have done over the last 7 years is to foment mistrust within our society. It's one of his signal achievements in that way. The ground has been ripe for it. Do you think, what are some of the concerns that you have when you look at how he might conduct influence operations? So if we take that mutually assured digital destruction narrative and say, he may or may not conduct a destructive cyber attack within an escalation ladder, what are some of the ways you're afraid he might use influence operations?
So I have to say, this is actually the one silver lining. I mean, after years of just being reactive to Russia's information war, this was the first time, and I'm not just saying this because now I'm a little bit inside the tent in the US government now, but this was the first time we have taken a proactive approach to combat Russia's influence operations and information war.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we will be studying the declassification strategy that this administration pursued for years. This is the first time that we were willing to declassify intelligence, which is difficult for the US government, to say the least. We were able to call every card that he was about to play. We said, he will invade. He has made the decision to invade. He is going to come up with some pretext for this invasion. And everything we said essentially came true. We were off by a number of days, but for the most part, we called it. And he had no cards to play. And the cards that he has laid down, this BS about Ukraine or Zelensky being a Nazi and that they have to go in for denazification. I mean, it just is like amateur hour in terms of influence operations. And, the more recent one about how, the US and Ukraine are somehow pursuing biological weapons programs inside Ukraine. It's unbelievable how outlandish and ridiculous some of these influence operations have been so far. So far, so good on the influence front. And I've been really just heartened to see some of the cybersecurity community and the disinformation researchers come out and say, hey, instead of blocking Russian websites, how about we redirect Russians to a website with a message that contains real facts on the ground? I think that is brilliant as well. So far, they are losing the information war here, and it really is more the cyber operations that I worry about.
Yeah, and let's turn back to that in just a second. I think it's worth noting that Zelensky's capabilities as a communicator have significantly outpaced perhaps anyone in recent history, if not total history. I mean, people have been comparing him, I think, quite rightly to Churchill for his staying in Ukraine. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, like his communication skills and the way the Ukrainian government and his advisors going out to get coffee, for example, walking around the city, getting coffee, like what that does to Putin's calculus from the information operations standpoint. Do you have any thoughts in response?
Well, when I was in Ukraine, it was a different administration, but when I met with people inside that administration, what they said was that when NotPetya came and basically shut off their access to the internet, to emails, et cetera, the first thing they did was they went on Facebook and said, we're still standing. And they said, that is the most important thing you can do in these cases. You need to be able to communicate that you are still there, you're still standing. And I never really forgot that. And I think about it now every day as I'm watching Zelensky. That is what he's doing. He's saying, we're here, we're still standing. And yeah, it's amazing. I mean, when he was elected, everyone sort of dismissed his credentials because he was this comedian and actor who played a Ukrainian president. It was almost Trump-esque, I think, in the reaction to who is this guy who's sort of coming in and acting out the role. But wow, how we underestimated him. I mean, perhaps actors are better at leaders in times of war. I mean, he is nailing it on the information front, and he's out there and he's there in the office in Kyiv, and just some of the language he's using, I don't know if he has just the most brilliant speechwriters coming up with this stuff or he's able to do it ad hoc, but no, he really is a brilliant communicator. And like I said, on the information war front, Russia has already lost. And I don't know if they're going to ever be able to catch up.
That's a great point. I'd like to pivot to cyberspace operations and how the conflict might unfold vis-a-vis Russia. But for a second, I just thought it would be useful to pause to sort of set where we are, where the United States strategy is in dealing with this conflict. And so I'll offer my read, and I'd welcome your thoughts before we then pivot to some of the things we've been talking about. So Peggy Noonan had a piece that came out today, which I thought was a very helpful article in the Wall Street Journal, talking about the necessity for judgment. And David Axelrod actually retweeted it. So this is there's some bipartisan support for the narrative. And it builds on the statement that President Biden said yesterday, which is, this unprovoked aggression, Putin's war in Ukraine, we're gathering at a historic moment, the likes of which none of us have experienced, right? And we have to recall back our Cold War history. Like, this is a man who has nuclear weapons. And this conflict, to control its escalation, that is our ultimate concern, because we wouldn't be the Ukraine is being destroyed, and it is like a tremendous tragedy, like none of us have seen in some time for the way that he began the war. But we have to recall that if we don't manage the conflict correctly, he could use a thermonuclear tactical weapon. And that's the kind of outcome that we have to prevent. So our strategy, as it is, it's like if he was to use that weapon, and Peggy Noonan said it would break the taboo of use, that future monsters could then use it again when they get it, which is what we can't happen. So our strategy, as I read it right now, we have the sanctions, which have frozen at least 400 billion assets in Russia, which is a tremendous unifying moment, the alliance that came together, blocking Russia's access to SWIFT. Then there's the NATO alliance, which is hardened most symbolically, I think, with Germany's allocation of $100 billion overnight with its defense budget, which led to a storm of support outside the Bundestag, which is amazing. You have countries like Sweden and Finland, which have historically not participated in arms shipments, which are sending anti-tank missiles en masse into Ukraine. Switzerland, buying on board with the sanctions. This is a tremendous sign for a country that for far too long has withheld its powers around the banking structure. And then, of course, we have the arming of Ukraine. And it's useful, I think, to offer, or at least my read, and Nicole, you were there when this began, I think, when you began your book, the history of non-lethal and lethal training assistance that we've provided to Ukraine that really began in 2015 after the invasion of Crimea. That's $2.3 billion before the invasion. That's a significant sum of money. That's in foreign military financing and in training and exercising. And some of the things that were included in that financing, which I think is useful for folks' memories, there are lots of anti-tank weapons, sniper rifles, electromagnetic warfare detection capabilities, counter UAV capabilities, night vision goggles. There's a litany of things that we'd given to Ukraine. Foreign military financing is given, not selling. There are other countries that buy weapons. We're giving it to them. And now, in the last 12 hours, there's been first there was a massive uptick in anti-tank weapons that were going in. And then Congress has just passed a $13 billion military and humanitarian assistance bill that is significantly escalating more anti-tank weaponry. And I will note, in a surprise for me, Mitch McConnell has really been the one pushing for more assistance, right? He asked for an addition of $1.5 billion. And all of this is happening within the backdrop of the conflict itself, but also Zelensky's bravery, which is just remarkable as a transformation of how that assistance flows. There was an article then, which we talked about yesterday, The Economist piece, which made a very good point that said, if Putin begins to take more lands in Ukraine or outside of it, right, non-EU members that he might invade, i.e. Moldova, he will be emboldened. He may not be so emboldened as to do something against NATO, which again would trigger that mutual escalation narrative that we're concerned about, but he will be emboldened to conduct cyberspace operations. And so I think that's an interesting, first of all, I'm curious for your read on the strategy as it unfolds, if that reflects your read of what I've said. And second, what are some of the concerns that you think what might he go after in cyberspace?
Well, I pay very close attention to what he says. And what he said last September was that if the West, or if any country, I think he specifically called out the United States, intervened in Ukraine, that would cross his, quote, red line. If Finland and Sweden join NATO, that would cross his red line. So it's interesting because red line is not part of Russian military verbiage. It's a Western term. It's a Western military term. And the way I read it was that if this happens, we will turn to cyber weapons, cyber attacks in a way that this world has never seen. And this is why everyone in our industry, in this space, in cyber, has never been more terrified than we are right now. Because what people don't realize is that the West, the United States, is one of the most vulnerable countries when it comes to cyber attacks for a number of reasons we can get into. We are automated. We have structured ourselves so that the bulk of our critical infrastructure, more than 80%, is in private sector hands. There are no laws requiring that private companies meet any kind of standard for cybersecurity. So for the most part, they're all running software that can't even get patches because it's so old. They're not turning on multi-factor authentication. They're not practicing good cyber hygiene. They're not, pulling their most critical controls off of the internet. And Russia has access in a lot of cases. It has access. I mean, just look at what I've covered at the Times. They've gotten access to our grid. There was a screenshot that Homeland Security published a couple of years ago showing Russian hackers literally with control of the power switches at a power plant.
This began in 2015 and then accelerated through 2018, even though the sanctions were on them. Yeah.
That's right. We've seen them probe our nuclear plants. There's no evidence that they got to the controls in those cases. But why is Russia trying to hack into our nuclear plants? We've seen SolarWinds, which was this attack a couple of years ago with a company in Texas, I think in Austin, SolarWinds, where they didn't have a strong commitment to their internal security. Russia discovered that and used them as a Trojan horse to break in to the networks of more than 400 of the Fortune 500 and every critical federal agency, including the agency that's supposed to be keeping us safe in this realm, the Homeland Security Department, but also the Department of Energy, its nuclear labs.
Treasury.
So they have the access. They're there. They have the capabilities. We saw them launch these capabilities in Ukraine. What they have not had until right this moment was the geopolitical impetus to pull the trigger on these capabilities. And with everything we are doing, with how unified the West is, I mean, I love that you called out Switzerland. I mean, the fact that we've gotten Switzerland on board, the fact that even as a country here in the divided United States of America, there is so much support for what we are doing right now with sanctions and the ban and SWIFT, et cetera. At a certain point, he will probably push the button on some of these capabilities. And the only silver lining is that, one, because of the just rampant ransomware attacks that have played out over the last couple of years, boards of directors are finally asking, wait a minute, how do we make sure this doesn't hit us? So we're slightly more aware and maybe just slightly more hardened than we were 2 years ago. And the other thing is, and this is where it's been pretty cool actually to be inside the tent a little bit, we've talked about the need for public-private collaboration on cyber for years, and it never happened. The private sector basically said the government sucks at this. How do we take cyber away from government and put it in private sector hands? The government has said, wait a minute, how can we help you? How can we do anything if you're not sharing threat data with us, if you're not even telling us when you get breached, if you're not telling us when you pay a ransomware group in Russia, how do we even go about helping you? And finally, there's just this mind meld finally happening where the public and private sector get it, that it actually, this is a whole of society problem. And it's going to take both sides coming together, sharing threat data, sharing information about attacks as they're hitting so that we can stave off those attacks on the rest of the industry. And that is really happening in a way that I have never seen before right now. So the good news is we're not letting a good crisis go to waste. The bad news is we are still so vulnerable.
Yes, yeah. There's a number of strings I want to pull here on things that you flagged. So the first, because you just talked about public-private cooperation, One of the things that your agency that you're advising has done that is so hopeful. So I wrote a monograph called A Public-Private War about how to build this cooperation. The Cybersecurity Solarium Commission made that notion a principle of their work, and then they ended up passing a law, which is great. For everyone in the audience and watching this on the internet, cybersecurity has been a tremendously bipartisan process in Congress because of this commission. So you have Senator Angus King, an independent senator in Maine, and Mike Gallagher, a rep from, I believe, Wisconsin, on the Republican side, working together to shepherd a ton of legislation. It was a tremendous amount of legislation. And one of the things that came through was the stand-up of what's called the JCDC. And if you hear AC/DC songs in the back of your head, you're not the only one. Jen Easterly, the director of CISA, who's the agency where Nicole is advising, when she announced the agency, I think she had a video with AC/DC in the background. So I wonder if you could talk, such as you can, about the cooperation that's ongoing through this structure and how in some ways you see companies responding to the government. Are they building trust? Are people making friends? Are they yelling at each other on Slack? Or you don't have to talk about that part, but how's it going?
I mean, I'm still a little bit outside, I'm an unpaid advisor. But yeah, I mean, it's Slack. It's like, who knew that setting up a Slack channel could be so effective? Just suddenly people are on there trading information about the first wiping attacks that we saw in Ukraine, about the first denial of service attacks. One of the first things, so much is happening so quickly, but one of the first things Russia did was launch what's known as a denial of service attack on Ukrainian banks and government ministries. And it was bad for about a day. People couldn't get money out of the ATM, et cetera. But working together with Ukraine, CISA, private companies, very quickly, Cloudflare and AWS started providing back-end support to those targets. And so the blast radius was fairly limited. And that happened just in real time, okay, this is happening. How do we mitigate it? Hey, will you step up and provide support? And it all happened, within a matter of hours. That we've never seen that kind of public-private collaboration at speed before.
Yep.
Unfortunately, that was really the big fallout from Snowden.
Yes.
The willingness from companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon and everyone who showed up on that PRISM PowerPoint deck that was first released, they said, why would we ever give the government more data, more communication, more information than we need to if they are basically hacking our systems and throwing us under the bus in this larger surveillance program? And unfortunately, I think it was sort of a misguided reaction, because really what the government was asking for wasn't consumer data in this case. It was like anonymized information about malware strains and computer viruses and where have they gotten in? How can we help you get them out? So unfortunately, that fallout really hit pause on a lot of this collaboration. But now it feels like we're finally in a place where we can put that behind us and say, okay, yeah, and yes, I'm so happy you called out that this is probably one of two of the last bipartisan issues in Washington.
Yep.
I wish it was a little bit more bipartisan sometimes, but I think between this and China, I think this is the last thing that you see Republicans and Democrats working together on. I mean,
Yep.
yeah, Mike Gallagher, the representative from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I went to college together, and it was really hard for me personally to see him not vote for Trump's impeachment on the issue of Zelensky. And I need you to do us a favor, though, because I just had spent so much time in Ukraine. But there was no talk of that on the Cyber Solarium Commission. They really did a good job of putting the partisan BS aside and saying this is an urgent problem for our country, and we need to move fast on this. And so I think they told me politics never came up once. And so this is, again, we're nowhere where we need to be because so much of this is in private sector hands, and so many of these companies still can't even let their imagination go to the place where they could even imagine that someone would use their systems for some kind of cyber terrorist attack. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more and more of these attacks really cause substantial damage. I mean, Colonial Pipeline,
Yes.
here's an attack.
Well, yeah, can we pause on this for just a second? I want to ask, like, throw a couple layers onto this part of the narrative, and then in about 4 or 5 minutes, we'll open it up for questions. I was in the Pentagon, I think the week that Snowden happened. I was in the cyber policy office as the head chief strategy officer for cyber policy, which is a grand-faluting title. We'd met with some folks from Google. I won't name them. They were extremely talented. They were like, we're building this thing called Project, it was the preamble to Project Shield. Okay, maybe that outed them a little bit, I'm sorry. It was great. We're like, let's cooperate. So many things we can do together. 2 weeks later, I called one of them to get his social security number, and I called him, he gave it to me, and the next day Snowden happened. And they had to pull out of all conversations with the US government. And that was what led me to write A Public-Private War, because the vision, actually, it's not just sharing threat information. I'll announce this now to advocate for anyone in the room who shares this, and to you, Nicole, as well. It's like Akamai, AWS, Microsoft, Google, they see more behavior on the internet than anybody else in the world. And if you're Cyber Command, and I want to ask you about this from a deterrent standpoint, if you're US Cyber Command who has the mission to conduct a counter-offense operation against Russia, who could conduct, and they've done operations now, they did a counter-offense operation in advance of the 2018 election, blunting the Internet Research Agency offline, and then they did one against Revil after the Colonial Pipeline attack to impose some pressure, right? So these things were coming at us. But if you're Cyber Command and you're saying, I'm now responsible for trying to hit a piece of malware, this is a terrible analogy because the internet doesn't work like this, that's flying through space with a needle, then I can't do that on my own. So you want to turn to the large tech companies and say, what can you see and how can we cooperate? And the problem after Snowden was that opportunity evaporated, but then you have the Russian interference in the election in 2016, which allows people in the tech sector for the first time really in Silicon Valley to say, the things we're building make us vulnerable, right? It's like, that's what the impact is of what we've done. And so the threat perception had to change. And you talk about bipartisanship around cybersecurity or China. Now, obviously, we have a tremendous amount of bipartisanship for supporting the Ukrainians in their conflict with the Russians. So we're layering into this moment, this unique moment where there could be possible unity between Republicans and Democrats and deeper collaboration between the public and private sector to conduct counter-offense operations, which is exactly why I'm so proud of you for having transitioned and gone to do what you're doing, because this agency is a great place to do it. Now, the one question I wanted to ask, having given that overlong thought process here, in the narrative of mutually assured digital destruction, if Putin becomes emboldened in cyberspace, how much do you think he's afraid of US Cyber Command?
So I thought he wasn't afraid. You know, this is one thing I'm probably guilty of, is we all sort of built Putin into this 12-foot tall monster. And now what we're seeing every day is, wow, they're using some pretty old tanks and they haven't maintained them, and they grossly underestimated Zelensky in Ukraine. So I used to think he was just going to push every button here. And I have to backtrack a little bit and just say that in 2018, at the New York Times, my colleague David Sanger and I learned that Cyber Command was hacking into the Russian grid, the power grid, and making a pretty loud show of it. And we spent months reporting this out, and then we called the National Security Council in 2018 and said, we have this story, we're about to put it on the front page of the New York Times saying that you're hacking the Russian grid. And what does this mean for deterrence? What does it mean that you're legitimizing civilian systems like the power grid in sort of this larger mutually assured digital destruction approach? And as a journalist, you assume that that conversation was going to be incredibly painful and incredibly awkward, and that they were going to say things like, you can't possibly publish this because you will have blood on your hands, or this is all classified and we're not going to give you anything at all. And instead they surprised us. They said, we have no problems with you publishing this story about us hacking the Russian grid. In other words, we want Putin to know that we are inside his systems, and if he does anything close to what he's been doing in Ukraine, shutting these systems down, we won't hesitate to turn around and do the same to him. And that was our strategy. And I don't think I gave it enough credit. I mean, it's still too soon, but I don't think that Putin wants to risk a direct confrontation, cyber confrontation with the United States, where we're just going back and forth, shutting down each other's power grids and systems.
Yeah.
I also think that one potential use that the United States would have for these weapons is some kind of combo hybrid cyber information effort where we would essentially try to hack what Russia's doing now by putting up a Chinese-like Great Firewall to try and break through and provide real information on the ground. I mean, there's so many possibilities here, and I don't think either side wants to risk an escalation. But I've never seen sort of the ingredients for one are all there right now.
That's a great point. And that raises a question, I think, that is undoubtedly in everybody else's mind, which is, to what degree, what will it take, do we believe, for the Russian people to begin to put pressure on the organization around Putin and himself, such that there is a change? Because that's the ultimate hoped-for outcome of all the pressures that's being put on Russia. When you have a wicked man in charge of extremely dangerous weapons, the most powerful mode of change is to achieve a transformation within Russia. And that's the part, I mean, as I said on Twitter the other day, I'm no Russia expert, but F that guy, right? Like, so, you've spent much more time thinking about his mind than I have. But what do you think is
I'll tell you a story. The story that Vladimir Putin tells of his childhood, the defining story of Putin's childhood that he has shared in interviews was that of a rat in his apartment building. So he grew up in this dilapidated apartment building in Leningrad, and for fun, they used to chase rats around the building and with sticks. And so he tells this story about how one day they backed this giant rat into a corner and they were poking it with their sticks. And at a certain point, the rat lunged at them. And this is, again, the defining story of Vladimir Putin's childhood was a rat that they backed into a corner and then lunged at him. And he said he'll never forget sort of the fright that they had with this cornered rat coming for them. And I think about it every single day during this invasion, because he is the cornered rat. He's the cornered rat, and there's no way that he's not going to come lunging at us. And we obviously have to take nuclear into consideration, but I'm actually not worried about it right now. That could easily change. What I'm worried about more is some kind of cyber retaliation. And again, you'd have to be a fly on the wall to know whether perhaps our hack of the Russian grid kept the Kremlin from doing more interference in 2020. Perhaps our hack of the Internet Research Agency's computers ahead of the 2018 midterm elections kept the Kremlin from going full gangster on the midterms that year. I just don't know. But what I know is that they've shown that they're bold enough to launch these capabilities before. But before, they were always considered just under the threshold of war. But I think now that we are actually in a war context, the likelihood that we would respond to any kind of cyber attack that the Kremlin launched here, either directly from the GRU or through ransomware groups that are really proxies for the Kremlin, I think we would respond proportionally. And we haven't done that really yet. We have always chosen the low-level diplomatic penalty when Russia came for our elections. SolarWinds attack. We've always responded with sanctions or indictments or naming and shaming or kicking out Russian diplomats. Why? Because we were scared that if we struck with a cyber attack of our own, he would strike back, and we know that we are actually much more vulnerable here, and we know he knows that. So just like last point, if you want to know what the cyber defense status is of the United States, look at Colonial Pipeline again. Here was the biggest conduit for gas, jet fuel, diesel to the Eastern Seaboard. And what did it take to preempt its shutdown? A lack of two-factor authentication and a crappy password.
Yep.
And unfortunately, they are the norm. They're not the exception.
Yep.
And so it is not a matter of, can they certainly can. It's a matter of when would they launch an attack like Colonial Pipeline, but perhaps a coordinated attack across major pipelines in the United States. And one thing I often remind people is when I was reporting out the Colonial Pipeline attack, I got my hands on a confidential Department of Energy assessment that said, as a country, we can only afford 2 or 3 more days of downtime. And it wasn't so much the gas or the jet fuel, it was the diesel, because we require diesel to run our factories. And so 2 or 3 more days of that would have ground the United States of America's economy to a halt. And that was from one pipeline. So imagine that attack hitting, a coordinated attack on many different pipelines. I think that is the nightmare scenario, and it's entirely possible.
Yep. If I could offer I'd like us to pivot in closing to strategies that organizations can adopt to really improve their cyber defense posture. Because I take your point, and I like your point very much, that we are so vulnerable that if you don't throw rocks in a glass house because somebody could throw a rock back at you, and then you'd be. So there are practical steps that have to be taken. And as someone who thought about this, I wrote in writing the first 2 national cyber defense strategies of the United States. My initial finding was we are so in trouble from a deterrence by denial standpoint, because you have deterrence by cost imposition, and you have deterrence by denial, and these are metaphors from the nuclear age. If you're thinking about it from a cybersecurity standpoint, we're actually quite good on the cost imposition function, but to all the points you just raised, we're not on the denial side. And the 3 points that I like to make, because there's a rule of 3, if there's a 4th, I'm always going to forget it, right? First is you assume breach and you plan for known threats. You know you're going to be breached. That needs to be the first thought in your head every day if you're in charge of managing a security organization. You plan for known threats. There's a thing called the MITRE ATT&CK framework. When I first started working in cyber in 2010, a nation state that's in the news all the time broke into a financial organization that I can't name, and none of us could talk about it because it was top secret. There's no way to describe what adversaries do. Now we have a means, 10 years later, to say we know the tactics that the adversaries employ. There are things like privilege escalation. There are things like lateral movement, which occurred in the SolarWinds intrusion. There are things like discovery. They can move through a network. Now, lateral movement's a great example because they made their way in through a Trojan horse injection, through a supply chain injection, through an organization here, made their way into a network, and because there were no internal firewalls between servers in a data center, they could move laterally throughout it. And when that first happened, we wrote an article about zero trust. A colleague of mine, Matt Glenn, said, why is there no zero trust strategy for the US government? Because zero trust would have prevented lateral movement. So assume breach and plan for known threats, invest in best-in-class defense capabilities. If you've set certain kinds of requirements, you need to buy the capabilities. You need to have the people, processes, and technologies in place to do that. And then the third is train, exercise. And then the narrative I like to use here is like, if you built the best Navy in the world, which we have, if you built the best Navy in the world and left it in port for a year, would you expect it to defeat the People's Liberation Navy in battle? No, you would not, because they would not be prepared, because they'd never exercised. The military trains all the time. The problem with the digital age is the men and women who are managing our cybersecurity operations centers, many of them do come from military backgrounds, but many of them don't, and they don't adopt this, I'm facing off against a nation state, so I need to train and plan. And if we know the tactics that they're going to employ, if you're a Colonial Pipeline, you need to run those tactics, and then you're going to find out if your two-factor authentication is working or not. And 30 to 40% of the controls in a system aren't working. I'm sorry, only 30 to 40% are working at a time, so up to 60% are not, because they're not tested and trained. So having given my own preamble, like, what are some recommendations that you would offer for the defense community, and what makes you hopeful about it being adopted?
So this is where I say ransomware is a blessing in disguise, because what it's really doing is it's pen testing the United States. It's showing us just how vulnerable we are. Like I said, finally, boards of directors are saying, wait a minute, how do we stop a ransomware attack? As you know, and as I know, this is just the most visual edge of the cyber threat. And for years, Chinese APTs were hacking our intellectual property left and right. We were catching Russia probing the grid and pipelines, but we were catching China probe those pipelines too. And these attacks were really easy to bury. So long as they didn't come for your customers' social security numbers, you didn't really have to report them. There was no state mandatory breach disclosure law. The only laws we have say if it touches customers' personal information, you have to report it. So it's pretty easy to hide those attacks. Ransomware is really hard to hide. One, because it freezes up your systems. Two, because now these groups kind of hit you with the 1-2 punch, where they don't just freeze your systems and lock up your data, but they leak it out online on their happy blog or whatever our evil was calling their leak site. And so it made it impossible for companies to hide the fact that they had been breached. And finally, they're saying, how do we protect ourselves? Well, more than 80% of ransomware attacks are enabled by a lack of multi-factor authentication. That's all it would have taken to prevent 80% of attacks. There are some attacks you'll never be able to prevent, a supply chain attack, a zero-day attack. And that's where your advice is critical. Assume breach and know what you're going to do hour 1, hour 2, week 1. It is so important to assume breach constantly. How are you going to limit the blast radius from these attacks? And
there are technologies you can buy to do that, right? Once they're inside.
There are technologies you can buy to do that. And I think if I'm guilty of anything at the New York Times is I've been covering so much sort of state-to-state digital combat that I've left people with this impression that this is a fighter jet operation over here, that it's really like a military government problem, when really it's the more apt analogy is like a cyber pandemic. Yes, governments have a role to play by setting policy, by making laws and regulating this space, because by the way, every market incentive leads us down a path of further vulnerability. But businesses really in some ways have a more important role to play, because businesses control more than 80% of our critical infrastructure here, like our dams and our water and our power and our pipelines, telecom, hospitals. But then individuals have a critical role to play too, because we're the ones who keep allowing these hacks to happen. Everyone always says, well, what would China want with me? I'm pretty boring. There's nothing on my devices that they would want. Okay, fine. You might be the most boring person on earth, but the fact is that usually they come for the boring people in the organization and they convince them to click on a link or an attachment. And then that is, patient zero in an attack, and then they conduct lateral movement and move over to the really interesting stuff. And so it's critical that we train employees in what these breaches look like. I mean, the first thing that now happens at Google is Heather Adkins, who's their head of cybersecurity, walks new employees through the Aurora attack, which was the Chinese attack on Google in 2009, 2010, so that they understand that they could be responsible ultimately for a mega breach of the company that could potentially put dissidents' lives at stake. That is the story they tell. And that is the story that I think every organization needs to share with its employees. You are responsible for the collective cybersecurity of this organization and potentially, the nation, because look at SolarWinds.
That's a great place to open it up to questions. And I've given us far too little time to do that. I said I was going to give a lot more, but it's so interesting talking to Nicole, right? Can we get an amen about that? Yes, indeed. So, Nicole, this is my first time doing Slido, so everyone has to be patient with me. This is a good question, actually, the first one. Do you see any scenario in which a cyber attack warrants a nuclear response? Why or why not?
I hope not. But no, I think we are getting to a place where these cyber attacks, because we're so connected, are starting to resemble a military attack. Colonial Pipeline, ultimately, at the end of the day, the impact to the country was the same if the Kremlin had dropped a bomb on that pipeline. They just went about it in a more indirect way, and they did it with code. And I should say it as if a criminal group, because we don't think that that was Kremlin directed. But we basically have said, we could respond to a destructive cyber attack with kinetic weaponry. You've been probably closer to those discussions than I have, so I'm curious to hear your answer. I think using a tactical nuclear weapon in reaction to one of these attacks would be a stretch, but never say never. What if there was a cyber attack at an American nuclear plant that caused radiation leaks? I don't know.
Yeah. I think on this one, the best example of a destructive cyber attack having strategic impact was that conducted by Stuxnet, which involved countries that planned it. And it slowed down Iran's nuclear reactors for a couple of years, right? Colonial Pipeline caused panic, but the interesting thing about the Colonial Pipeline attack, now the attack on the Ukrainian electric grid was probably the second one. It was the most terrifying, right? And then the point I was going to make on Colonial Pipeline, that was a panic-based reaction. The reason that prices went up at the pump was because of panic. So it's very hard to conduct a cyber attack that can have a significant impact in some ways, right? And there's a recoverability. To escalate, in what way could a cyber attack escalate into a nuclear situation? It would probably involve some element of kinetic capabilities running into one another and lives being lost. I firmly believe there has to be lives that are lost for a cyber attack to participate in the escalation ladder such that we would end up in a more dangerous situation. But I hope that I'm right about that. Let's,
well, it's interesting that
go ahead.
After Colonial Pipeline, at Biden's first summit with Putin in Geneva, if you remember, right afterwards, Biden walked out and spoke to reporters. And he said it in this very folksy Biden way, but he said, I said to Putin, how would you feel if one of your pipelines was taken down in an attack? And the way I read that was, oh, that's a pretty thinly veiled threat. If you hit our pipelines again with code, we will turn around and do the same to you. But would we then would we escalate? I don't think so. I think there are no real rules of engagement in this space. And by default, all we have is sort of this idea of proportionality. If you hit us, we will respond proportionally. Those were Obama's words after the Sony attack.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we just have 2 more minutes, and I saw a question that is off the screen now, but I thought that was quite good, actually, which basically amounted to, what do you think is the future of warfare? Are we more likely to have more kinetic attacks or cyber attacks? And I think the person asked a leading question, which I thought was a good one, which is it not better if the future of warfare is cyber?
Yeah, I mean, the most sophisticated cyber attack, cyber weapon that has been used in history was Stuxnet. And this was the attack that Jonathan sort of evaded this point, but was conducted by the United States and Israel on Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. But what it was at the end of the day was a counterproliferation effort. And I actually go back to that sort of slice of history in the book because I think it's fascinating. I mean, 2006, this is I'll make this super short, but 2006, Israel was pressuring us to hand over bunker buster bombs, which is what they would have needed to take out Natanz because it's buried under so much concrete. And every simulation that the Pentagon ran at the time suggested that even if we were to just hand over these weapons and look the other way, we would be dragged into World War III. And this was W's second term. There was no appetite for a third war in the Middle East. 2006, we were seeing more Americans come home in caskets than ever before. And so Bush famously said, get me a third option. And Keith Alexander, who was head of the NSA at the time, provided that third option. He said, I think we can do some damage to their nuclear program with code. And that is what we did. That was Stuxnet. You know, at the end of the day, it was brilliant. It was the digital equivalent of the Manhattan Project, only in reverse, because it was a counter-proliferation effort. It went in and it destroyed the uranium by messing with the rotors that spin the uranium in the enrichment process. In some cases, we sped it up. In some cases, we slowed it down. All the while, if you were an engineer at these plants, everything appeared to be functioning normally, but behind the scenes, we were destroying a fifth of Iran's uranium supply, and we set back their nuclear ambitions years. And at the end of the day, it kept Israeli jets on the ground, and it arguably saved lives.
That's a great, Nicole, we're coming down to 1 second here. So
Oh, yeah.
that's an excellent.
What I was going to say is, unfortunately, it got out like these things do, and it showed the world what's possible, what the destructive potential is of code. And that is now the world that we are living in.
Yes, that is a great, very good point to end on. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Nicole Perlroth for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Jonathan.
Buy our book.
Thanks to everyone who read the book.
Yes. And if anybody has questions that we didn't get to that I can answer, Nicole, I'll try my best to be your proxy.
Thank you. Enjoy the barbecue.
Thank you. Bye.